Please join me in welcoming Dan Snyder to the Wichita Pachyderm Club.
It's wonderful to be with adults today. I feel like I'm playing hooky. I've been looking forward to getting here with you. I know many of you. It's been my privilege to get to know you in the time I've been here in Wichita. Tracy and I moved here about 3 years ago. I guess we're coming up on 4 now. From New York City. And but don't let that bother you. I'm an old Sioux Cityan. So in a way, this is just kind of swinging back around. Today, I want to talk. I understand you talk about political things here sometimes. And so be patient with me. Believe it or not, I will be talking about politics. You might get some things that are, you might hear some things that might make you a little mad, and forgive me again, I might be wrong. So if you want to talk to me later about it, or just in the course of our time together in this marvelous city, look me up, and I sure love to talk. And of course, you'll gather that as we go on here. When I say I came here about 3 or 4 years ago, I'm reminded of, and being an old Sioux Cityan, I'm sort of reminded of the return of Odysseus. As a matter of fact, when we finally slipped our hawser chain there and moved out to Wichita, back to the Midwest from New York City, in the U-Haul truck, I was listening to the John Fagel's translation of the Odyssey all the way back, just by happenstance. It was something that I knew I was going to have to be teaching on when I got here, and I wanted to get back in touch with it. But some things came to my mind as that occurred, and I'll be sharing some of that with you. Of course, it's my job to deal with ancient literature and logic, and so I tend to think of things that way. And as I say, if I'm going to be talking about politics with you today, it'll be in a very generic sense. But I think there's some marvelous things to be gleaned from this, and I would share with you that it is my very deep privilege to be teaching these kinds of things to kids today. We'll talk about that a little bit more and why that's worthwhile. But I would characterize all of this business as sort of the poetry of time itself. It might sound kind of highfalutin, but what I mean by that is that as time goes on, and I look around this room and I see people who have put in some time, that's great. We need more of that. I might make comments on the unwisdom of ruling with children at this particular moment. But let's refer to the wisdom of the ages for just a moment. The ages themselves, as they go around, seem to show us things. And if we are attentive, we can learn, and we can improve, we can grow together. As a matter of fact, the old proverb says that he who does not learn the rebuke of life is doomed. And so sometimes what we find in these old lessons are things that we may not like, that might not flatter us, but of course those are calls to action. One of the things that sticks in my mind as I think about the ancient world and the Mediterranean, the seat of our Western civilization, I think of the ancient ruins of Messina. The ancient ruins of Messina, rediscovered in 1870 after about 2 centuries of disappearance for some strange reason from the popular mind. It may be that the Age of Enlightenment came into play and people started to think of anything written in an old book as a myth. Nevertheless, there was a man named Heinrich Schliemann, a German entrepreneur who had spent some time in the gold rush in San Francisco, but he took all of these stories as truth. I hesitate to say gospel, I won't go that far. Although he married an Athenian girl, moved to Athens, and was buried in a cenotaph there in Athens with some Homeric script on the side. So he took these things very religiously. But he took the Iliad in hand, which is the record, the historic and poetic record. Some say that when Homer goes to speak of historical things, he gets poetic. And when he gets poetic, he's sometimes historical. And so Schliemann took that in hand and he went out there to the Troad, modern day Turkey, and he rediscovered, I say rediscovered, Troy, the ancient city that had, in fable, been torn to the ground in the conflict between Achilles and Hector over Helen. And he discovered this, and he immediately deduced that then Messina, the ancient home of Agamemnon and Menelaus, must be real as well. And so he traveled across the Mediterranean through the Cyclades, and he came to the Argolid, the shore of the Peloponnesus, and sure enough, all he had to do was ask an old Greek shepherd, are there any ruins around? And he said, oh yeah, there's the city of Messina. So these guys knew. He went and he found this old architecture, gigantic stones neatly fitted together with the very coat of arms of the Achaeans. And what are these stones called? Well, we have them from Hesiod. They're called Cyclopean. This is Cyclopean architecture. One of the things I will encourage you to think about today is the Cyclops. And what does he have to do with politics? It turns out quite a bit. We learned originally about the Cyclops in Hesiod, in the Theogony. We learned that there were 3 Cyclops, or what do we say, Cyclopi, who were the sons of Poseidon, and of course invariably some mortal extraction as well. The Greek gods were like that. But we find that the Cyclops are fabricators of weapons, workers in iron, and architects. And so they build projects. They build. It's no secret, no surprise that we find Cyclopean architecture as the last remnant of the mighty Agamemnon who sailed to Troy. We might consider this as one of these poems in time as we look at this. And what we are looking at is the ruins of houses. Archaeology in the Mediterranean features houses. Houses in Crete. Cretans, actually, more clever than they sound today, but Cretans nonetheless lived in big houses that featured open piazzas in the middle and were the epitome of hospitality. Hospitality turns out to be one of the great virtues of ancient Greece, one of the great virtues of the founding of Western civilization. Pardon me for saying Western civilization, I'll say it a lot. I'm a Western civilization salesman to young minds, that's what I do. The hospitality featured in a large way and does today in the archaeology of the Mediterranean. So we encounter all of these ruins left behind, but they're empty houses, and we wonder about the original occupants. What happened? Today we have ruins. I like ruins. I'll briefly share, I was in Germany. I was in Heidelberg, and I was walking around on the Philosophenweg, this hill that you walk around and you think about Schiller and all these great philosophers. I used to be an opera singer, so I got to do that stuff, and it was great. And I'm walking around, and I see this old castle, the Schloss above Heidelberg, and it's destroyed. It's a ruin. It's just lying in a mess. And I asked the German tour guide, how did this come to be? And he said, I was younger then. He said, well, let me think if I can get this right. First, the Austrians came and knocked it down, and then the Swiss came through to fight the Austrians and knocked it down, and then the French came over and knocked it down fighting the Spaniards, and this all happened in the space of about 15 years, and thus you see it today. And by the way, there's a bunch of Japanese businessmen who want to turn it into a hotel. This was all a bit much for me because my American mind is accustomed to history that kind of moves from the Revolution, right, to the Civil War, to today. Done. And it's always 2 sides. That's it. You know, it's not this pie fight that European history is. Something strange about that. So ruins in our day, coming here to Wichita, I always have my nose is out for ruins. And we actually in Wichita seem to inhabit our ruins, which I like. I see the old high school buildings within the city limits, those magnificent piles of rock architecture. I love the fact that kids are still going to them. I met John Todd doing a talk about public education. And I found myself to become a fan of public education. I come from a long line of teachers. And actually just recently I had to think about it for the first time. And I found myself becoming a fan of public education conditionally. If it will do certain things, I like it. I think it's needful. So we're inhabiting a lot of our ruins. Full disclosure, I live in College Hill. And so I contemplate after every earth tremor the kind of tenuous nature of the mortar in my house. And I think about time again. There I go, I'm a history teacher. But when we look at ruins, we have the opportunity, as in Messina, to consider something that must have been possible at one time, but at some point became impossible. The fact that they're no longer inhabited means that a state of impossibility arose. And this is the question. Just what possibility was lost? Why did this occur? My wife and I spent about 7 years living on the corner of 63rd and 3rd Avenue there in Upper East Side, New York. We were in a building on the 4th floor of a 6-story walk-up. Underneath, they were building the large train station for the 2nd Avenue subway project. Now, why am I talking about the Second Avenue subway project and the same idea as ruins? Well, let me tell you. It's an experience I sort of relate as being constantly undermined. Below our apartment, bombs were going off, people were jackhammering all the time, and so I got curious. And I read the history of this project. When the Third Avenue L, there was an elevated railroad. If you watch old Nora movies, you'll see it there sometimes. They tore that thing down in about 1946. And why? Well, because a subway project had been approved in 1927. Lends an air of inevitability, you would think, in a normal universe, but no. 1927, the Second Avenue subway project never appeared in all those years. And you know what? It's only a quarter of the way done now. In order to claim success, the New York government had to break that project into 4 parts after it had been totally refunded 5 times. One complete funding allocation absorbed in an environmental study in the 1990s. And so, walking around New York, riding the subway, it's a very Jules Verne experience because most of those subways were built in a period of 7 years in the 1920s. Basta, complete, by private companies. As a matter of fact, the decline of those kinds of public projects is exactly coordinated with the time when the MTA, the New York Transit Authority, took over the construction of new projects. That was their death knell. They became ruins. They became impossible. Believe me. Infrastructure is problematic, and there's a reason for that. It doesn't necessarily have to do with government. It has to do with something else. So infrastructure in general, if you're following this and you want to take the Second Avenue subway project, which is sort of a century-long exercise in building something people built in the 19th century, if you want to put this together with something that's going on in our day, you will refer to California, who has approved, sort of, tenuously, in another form, which is now vastly larger, a rail project. A high-speed rail project, which is supposed to bind together the northern part and the southern part of that state with the middle, which makes sense, right? You would think they do need a corridor like this. It makes sense. I am a skeptic because I read history and I see what's going on here. I can extrapolate. You know what's going to happen there is that train project is going to be a project in perpetuity for jobs. And jobs are a great thing to talk about in the rhetoric of politics. They're not as great as a finished project, honestly. A fait accompli. Oh, look at our wonderful train. People say, yeah, that's old news. Where am I going to work? Oh, well, we have this hereditary train project that you, your grandfather, his grandfather, and I hope you're in the union, by the way. So I see that and I say, this is the way history works. And what makes it impossible to build a train that everybody agrees they need? Why is it impossible? Well, the Cretan and Mycenaean collapse occurred sometime in the 12th millennium BC and has baffled people ever since. What caused this? Was it some sort of an eruption, a volcanic eruption? Was it some sort of a cultural upheaval? People who study globalism wonder if the globalist economy occurred and wiped out all the local jobs or whatever. You see the same themes happen all the time. But let's just say that something made that entire culture disappear. And there may be a clue in the Odyssey. I promised you we'd get back to stories. Those of you who can remember the Odyssey surely remember the suitors. Yes? It's like this. Odysseus went away. He fought the Trojan War for 10 years. He's over across the Mediterranean. His faithful wife, Penelope, meanwhile, is back home in his large oikos, his home. And she is entertaining a crowd of suitors who are waiting to see when she will marry one of them because he's been gone all these years. He's not coming back. I want to be the new king of Ithaca. I want to marry you. They're hanging out for 10 years and 10 years more while Odysseus completes his Odyssey back home. And what are they doing? They're hanging around, eating the place dry. They're drinking all the wine in the cellar. They're eating all of the herds. They're devouring all the cheese. They're making the bards sing, and they're messing the place up. I guess it's a great boon for the service industry, but there's not much happening in Ithaca. So what we see may be a presage of the collapse of Mycenaean culture. Right there in a microcosm. There's a lot in Homer. This goes on and on and on, and you'll laugh when I tell you what happens. Penelope, very craftily, promises the suitors that she will marry one of them as soon as she has finished weaving the funeral shroud of Laertes, her father-in-law. She begins weaving in the morning. She weaves all day. This is where we get the word distaff, by the way, ladies, for the role in culture in those old days. They make all the clothes. So she's weaving all day, all day, all day, all day. And then when the suitors go to bed, they fall asleep in a drunken stupor. She unweaves the shroud. Ha! Well, I don't even have to explain. You see, it's so clear. So we call this parasitism. Parasitism makes things impossible. At some point, it creates ruins. This is a collapse. But a collapse of what? It's a collapse of the oikos. This is the Greek word from which we get oikonomia, economy. I used to get so incensed when I would hear people say, it's the economy, stupid, because me being sort of a cultural snob would say, oh, there's so much more to life than that. However, I had to rethink this. When the house collapses, there's no culture that's going to happen. And so the collapse of the oikos happens why? Here it is. Homer again comes to our rescue. Why? Throughout the Odyssey, we are told over and over again and shown in his actions that Odysseus is the model of Grecian virtue. Virtue is absent from the house. It will collapse from parasitism. Now we're zeroing in on something. And I promise you, I'll start talking about the Cyclops pretty soon. Where does he come in? So that thing that's collapsing is actually civilization itself. And it's collapsing because of an absence of virtue. And what happens there is that the culture is actually subsumed. The culture is just all about poor Penelope weaving and unweaving. That's it. It's just about jobs. She's working, just to keep those young men with nothing to do entertained. We come at last to the human and the machine. So I'm going to talk to you about virtue here a little more at length. I'm going to talk to you about culture. And I want to talk to you about the human and the machine, which is a confusion of means and ends. It can easily become the case that we worship government rather than enjoying the civilization it protects and stop growing our culture. This is a common phenomenon throughout history. We become machine worshipers. And now we're talking about the Cyclops. Remember, I told you that they were architects and producers of weapons. We would call them very productive people, GDP. These guys are GDP. Now, I told you might get mad at me. There's nothing wrong with GDP. I think the problem with words is that whenever we say just, now we're in trouble. Hyphens and sort of qualifiers get us into trouble very quickly. So understanding about what virtue is. The Cyclops, ladies and gentlemen, is not virtuous. I'll tell you why. So virtue, the way to achieve virtue is through ethics. That's the good life. We all talk about this. Eudaimonia. Choice, Aristotle says, is prior to action. Choice is prior to action. That means you must have leisure in order to pursue virtue. One of the hallmarks of Western civilization, and the reason it is the best approach, is because it has been shown to provide the most leisure to its participants. Without leisure, there is no culture, there are no ethics. So Aristotle would say that happiness comes from a life of good deeds, and then it comes from friends, and it comes from contemplation. This is happiness. The enabler of the highest good is known as arete in Greek, excellence, you might say, or virtue, which comes from the Latin virtus. There's a tower of virtue which goes all the way back into scholastic history. When we think about it, there are four cardinal virtues. There are more spiritual virtues, but I will leave it right here in just the realm of pure Western civ and reason. 4 virtues: prudentia, or wisdom; justice; virtus, or courage; and temperantia, or temperance. These 4 things. The Cyclops has none of these. Prudentia, wisdom. It deals with what is. Can I know the truth about things? Do I recognize how things are? 2, it has to do with my decisions concerning those things as they are. And thirdly, often overlooked, wisdom is born out in action. The man who knows how things are, knows what to do, and doesn't do it is foolish. I think we can think of other axioms. All that's necessary for evil to prevail is for good men to do nothing. These kinds of things come from that. Justitia, justice. This is, my friends. Pardon me for saying the word justice without any clothing. Just justice. No hyphens. Justice is what is due to the other. It is the virtue that deals with other human beings. That's it. That's it. What is due to everyone else? If I'm thinking about myself in conjunction with justice, I'm probably doing it wrong. Because there are other virtues about this. But justice is outward looking. It's looking for other people. Virtus, I like to use the Latin because it's kind of a stick in the eye. In the modern warfare of words, the ancient history of what we call courage, if someone is courageous, we might say he's manlike, manly. Virtus is a Latin word that comes from vir, which is the word for man. Now, ladies, I apologize because here's what's really going on. Manlike means what distinguishes the species of humanity from animals. Courage, we do things that might hurt, and we do it because it's courageous. So justice deals with other people. Courage deals with the world itself. What may happen? Flat tires, much worse things. Things like that. Finally, temperantia. I told you we'd get down to the core of the person themselves, but temperantia, do we talk about this anymore? No, I don't think we do. Temperance. Temperance. And I feel funny talking about that right here in Kansas down the street from Carrie Nation's rampage, but she's talking about a species of temperance there, but the concept is sound. Temperance, and I might say this, temperance is the foundation of the tower of cardinal virtues. If you think about it, prudentia, or wisdom, is the hardest one to attain, and that's why we look for the elders to really have that. They've lived in the world a while. But what happens is all sorts of problems enter into the gate of intemperance. Because a person becomes intemperate in the pursuit of a certain pleasure or misconstruction of a pleasure or a pain, they what? They become not courageous. They will do things that are cowardly to achieve that pleasure, and in doing so, they trample on the rights of other people, and they are unjust. And guess what? That's not wise. They've become a fool. So you see that this thing falls from the bottom, and you might consider this when you're thinking about telling people to follow their dreams, or to go on delayed payment plans, or do all kinds of things like this. Be careful. You don't want to topple the tower of virtue. Why would you do that to somebody? I told you I'd be talking about politics, and so politics is actually, to the Greeks, it's a combination of civilization, culture, and government. That's what politics is. When the Greeks use that word, they're deriving it from polis, which is based on the amount of people who can live together. And here's the really neat surprise. Aristotle calls all politics friendship. And so what it really means is that people help each other. Even down to the basic level, you have something I need, I'll give you money for it. We have helped each other. We are engaging in a kind of friendship. The lowest level of friendship then is the friendship of utility. You are useful to me. Like, that guy from college who has a pickup truck or whatever. You need to move your couch. Oh, buddy. And then you have the next level of friendship was the friendship of pleasure. It is pleasant to be around people who can converse and who know things and are pleasant. If a man would have friends, he must show himself friendly. And the third level of friendship in this kind of construct of friendship is the friendship of virtue, according to Aristotle. Men love the goodness in each other. Yeah, that's a great level to get to. Aristotle goes on to say that there's a city can only be about, well, it has to be under 100,000 in size because you can't have that many friends. Which makes me think about Facebook. But that's another talk. So leisure is the basic principle of choice. We've talked about you have to have leisure to have action. You have to have leisure to exercise choice. You can't be ethical without it. And the thing that we do with our leisure time, folks, is this. There's a thing called schools, and they educate. Let me tell you about these two words. School comes from the Greek skolai, which is, what is it? It's leisure. It's the same word. Skolai. Our children are fortunate. They get to go to school. They're not out winnowing grain. They're not trampling on olives. You know, they're not doing these kinds of things because Western civilization has provided a level of leisure whereby we may educate our children. And in what? Well, I've told you, they should be thinking about virtue, and they should also be thinking about the things that make them and their neighbors productive. They should become useful. Since the dawn of modern Western concepts of education, by the way, education, educare, out, ducare, like il duce, the leader, educare, to lead out. A teacher leads a child from his ignorant state into the civilization he is meant to inherit. You might ponder in the background while I'm talking about this, the impossibility, the ruinous state of a school that does not propose to lead a child from some place to another place, but merely gives them skills and facts. That's a problem. And because we live in a society where we have something to say about our public school system, we should try to subvert that tendency towards civilization. We should say, you are the ones who are going to perpetuate civilization. And if the culture rots, there's not a good prospect for it. More about government in a minute. But first I want to say that the two basic purposes of education then, the final causes, if you will, one, for the student. One, to give to the student. The student himself knows what he will use that for. I educate a young person and I give them all the things that have been entrusted to me, and I say, here they are, here's what I know of. I hope you go farther. But look at what wisdom's in there. Look what joy is in there. Look what prospects are in there. I don't know what you're going to do with it, but I'm just the custodian. I'm passing this to you. The second one is for the police, to make our students better friends. One, for the student themselves, their interior life. Two, to make them better friends. Let me just make the connection there. You're grooming your friends of the future. Those students are your friends. If you think about them that way, there are some things you would not want done to your friends. Think about them that way. The police will unravel without it. I said I was going to talk about government, and so government. We have civilization, culture, government. They're related. Government itself, and according to Aristotle, is an art. Because we know these things, then the art of government is making a machine. Machines don't necessarily have to have gears and oil and solenoids or whatever. A machine can be made of agreements. I mean, I'm sure there are lawyers in the room. There's a certain mechanism that happens in the law. Legislation is a mechanism. What does it do? It keeps the possibility of civilization open, so it does not become impossible. So you see that cultures develop governments as tools to protect their civilization, the civilizing path. And if you understand it this way, then you can evaluate a good or a bad tool. And you know, God be praised. We have a very fine tool here in the United States of government. It doesn't mean everybody's adept with it, because after all, government is an art. When I say art, I say it in the ancient sense. Any kind of science that you can turn into action is an art. So the exercise of legislation is a high calling indeed, but we need to understand its relationship to the civilization, the culture, how it fits in politics. So finally, I want to have us consider this. An inordinate fascination with machinery is something that has characterized the modern age since probably the 18th century. Matthew Arnold writes about it in his book called Culture and Anarchy. And by the way, Matthew Arnold was a school inspector for the Queen Victoria, in the mid-19th century. And it's interesting because he's a guy who probably, because trains were coming into being at that time, saw more of England than anybody else had in that job. And so he was, I think I see a pattern. You know, he had this ability to kind of give an overlook. And he believed that two things were happening. One was Philistinism and the other one was barbarism. And we might think of them in our own day under two headings. And here's where I might get in trouble. Maybe I'm kind of convicted about it. I only say these things because I read them and I think, oh, I could be better. So with all humility, I will say this. The barbarism is sometimes called conservatism. Now here's how that can be. You're looking at a guy who teaches ancient history and everything, and I just believe some of my wisest friends are dead. All right, that's the way I see it. But when I think about this, I like Edmund Burke as the voice of conservatism myself, because I think that he points out the danger in revolutionary thought, that any kind of improvements as we go forward in cultivating civilization, these need to be incremental, and they need to take advantage of what people who have come before have done. So he had very piquant comments to be made about the French Revolution in his day. He's worth a read. But this conservatism can be barbarism in that it will not allow the penetration of ideas, right? We're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep wearing monocles and spats, by golly, and firing flintlocks on into the foreseeable future. It's always been done this way. This is the way it's going to be done. There are certain reactions that have to be made, folks, because of the way that technology works. I don't think the framers of the Constitution, I won't go into this too deeply, but I don't think they ever foresaw a time when so many people could communicate in such broad spaces so instantly. Space and time has become a different thing than it was. And so understanding that, well, here's what I will say. One more talk about this, one more little bon mot, and I'll leave it alone. I still think politics is local, because fundamentally I'm an Aristotelian. I think you have to know the people, you have to live in their space. I don't believe in electronic abstract friends on Facebook, that kind of stuff. And I don't like the fact that that word has become a verb at all. Now, Philistinism can be libertarianism. Libertarianism, in its most, its farthest flung form, and I'm going to quote Bastiat on that, I guess, because when I read his book, I see what he's saying. I would read him for the same reason I would read Ayn Rand. I see what you're saying. But this is a sort of, this is an all or nothing sort of look at the world. That freedom is the thing that's actually being, well, I've talked about leisure being necessary, but guess what? Where's the friendship in that? Where's the possibility of the greater goods that can be gleaned by living together in a real community, not an organized one, but one that happens because of geography and time, with real people? So thinking about community is a very important thing. It's a cultural exercise, and sometimes libertarianism can be a Philistine-style exercise because it just focuses on instrumentality. That's all it is. And we have to be careful about that. More about that in a second. Here's the kind of thing that's happened in our time, though. Kind of an admixture of these. You can have a problem with an admixture of these two approaches too, and it's weird. People like Karl Marx, who somehow think that the instrumentality of the government will bring about his posited destiny of humanity in a world community, which seems very strange. Actually, it seems very eschatological. It seems like he's making his own version of Revelation or something like that. He's talking about the end times, for crying out loud. I'm having a good time right now. Then I think about people like Tiberius Gracchus. We're studying him right now in ancient history. The Gracchus brothers, they saw in their day, in the 1st century BC, following the Punic Wars, the Carthaginian Wars, this is fascinating. They saw Rome falling apart. And why? All the family farms had become conglomerates, and all the family farmers have been kicked off those farms, replaced by immigrant or slave labor, and they couldn't find jobs in the city. And so what happened was they were all on the grain dole. You had to feed them. They were Roman citizens. And so they got, every day you'd line up and you'd get free grain shipped in from Egypt, which, by the way, led to the fight with Mark Antony and Cleopatra later on, and all these things that we know about. And so the Gracchi guy went out and tried to do a government reform, trying to preserve the culture, actually. They were worried about the culture of the Italian farmer. And what happened is, through government shenanigans, he did some parliamentary maneuvers, got some people very mad, and got himself murdered for his trouble. They say it was the first Roman murder in the Forum. And of course, many happened after that. Civility disappeared. The possibility of civilization was going away. And of course, Rome collapsed into an empire after that. It became not really a community anymore. It became sort of a conglomerate, a holding company for a bunch of other concerns. And if you were a Roman, too bad. You had one course. You could either get into the government or there wasn't much for you to do, or you could get in the military. That was about it. So the path of the Philistine, and the Cyclops was most definitely a Philistine. Now we're into the zone. When we listen to the State of the Union, and we know we're living in the age of the age of the Philistine. Here's where I talk about my job as a humanities teacher, why it's important. When we listen to the State of the Union, I don't care who's there. At some point in that speech, somebody will get up and say, we're falling behind, but we're making strides in science, technology, engineering, and math. STEM, right? And everybody will stand up. That's one time everybody will stand up. That's right. And when I look around that room, I don't see many bachelors of science. I see a lot of people who grew up in the humanities. There's a little disconnect here. I think of John Adams when he said, I study government so that my sons can study engineering and the trades so their sons can study arts. And he was pointing toward the instrumentality of government, the possibility of civilization and improvement, and finally culture, the capstone. And they fall down in that way too. Well, you could check out H.G. Wells and the Time Machine. You remember the end of that book? So you have all the instrumentality guys living underground, working on machines they don't understand anymore, but it's a job. And you have all the liberal arts guys who've totally disconnected it from reality. And it's just how I feel. And they run around and they caper in the sun all day. And occasionally the Morlocks who live underground sneak up at night and eat one of the humanities students. That's what I think of them. So a humanities student needs to be a realist and understand what he's doing. He's holding the wire that stretches all the way back to the gift of our civilization. And so civilization exists to promote leisure. The question then becomes, what do people do with their leisure? We're back to that educational process where part of the education is for the student. What are they doing when they have nothing else to do? I hope it's not opiates, right? So finally, thinking about ruins, we have some time for questions. This is great. I'm sorry for talking so fast. I'm a little animated about this. But I think it's timely. I think the old times are timely. And I think it behooves us all to look back. I will talk to you about these various books. I would recommend reading the books of Homer. I would recommend looking at Aristotle. What a clear mind. What a catalog of wisdom. So just to dip back into those old seminal works at the start of Western civilization. Let me also add this. There are some theories at work in the world right now by prominent historians that posit that the only civilizational game going in the world right now is actually Western Civ. China is enjoying its economic prosperity because it has adopted Western Civ. Honestly, that's what's going on. As a former opera singer, I can tell you, they're wild about Italian opera, more than we are. So it comes along with all the cultural jewels. And then you get all the processes too. The question is, kind of like Ben Franklin, can you keep it? Can you keep it? And you have to be immersed in the things that you've been given. And I will give you this as an exhortation. Because of the time we live in, never have people been more distracted and have more to know because of the ages that have rolled by. Think about that equation. And it might light a fire under you towards educational prospects and what you learn for yourself and what you can give to your neighbors, your friends. So here's the story of the Cyclops, real quickly. So Odysseus, he's sailing all around the Mediterranean. He finally encounters the Cyclops. They land there. They get on this beautiful island. There's sheep. They're running around. And they all trudge up. And, oh, look at this cave. There's a cave. They walk inside. It's lined wall to wall with cheese. And being Greek sailors, where customarily if a Greek lands somewhere in those days, one of the polite dinner time questions is, so what do you do for a living? Are you a pirate? They're not mad about it. They're just, no, not today, might be the answer. So civilization is kind of a loose idea still that they're working it out. You know, it's nice to be nice to the people in your town, but other towns. So they go, it looks like an unoccupied island, whatever. They find cheese. Oh, this is great. We brought some wine. Wine and cheese culture. So they sit down and they start eating all this cheese. They're having a wine and cheese party. The Cyclops comes home. All the sheep come in the house, which kind of reminds us of our Saxon forefathers living with the cows and everything. And they come in, the door rolls closed, and then he lights up a fire, and the Cyclops with his one eye, I imagine, he looks around and he sees, who are all these guys? But the next thought in his mind is very strange. They look tasty. Wow, what a Philistine. So he starts eating these guys one after another. And so at one point he strikes up a conversation with Odysseus. Now the thing that the Cyclops wasn't familiar with was wine. So Odysseus gets him drunk, and then they do him in. They stick a hot poker in his one eye. Ugh. It's a very graphic book, but 7th graders love it. So anyway, Odysseus is in there, and they strike up a conversation. So, where are you from? You got any people around here? Says the Cyclops. He's kind of buzzed at this point. They're having this weird conversation, and you know what's happening. He's trying to figure out, are these guys here alone? Can I eat them all, and nobody will come around here? And so he's kind of a libertarian, isn't he? So what happens is he's sitting there, and Odysseus, he says, so what's your name there, sailor? Odysseus says, oh, nobody. Oh, well, nobody. I'm going to eat you next. Well, not long after that, they poke out the guy's eye, and they sneak out with the sheep. I got to tell you, the life of the Cyclops is this. In the morning, the door opens, he goes out to work. In the evening, he goes back in, the door closes. His neighbors don't know him. And so what happens is he comes screaming out of his cave, and his neighbors, he does have neighbors, he's just never met them. They live around the other side of the hill. You can read the Homer yourself. It's really funny. And he starts screaming, and they say, oh, Polyphemus, that's his name. Polyphemus, what's wrong? He says, nobody has poked my eye out. They say, okay, go back to bed. Odysseus gets away. Look, the Cyclops has no friends. He actually has no politics. None. And he's a cannibal. So if you show up to visit him, you want to share some hospitality? No, that doesn't even exist. There are no friends in that world, you see? And so Aristotle himself quotes this at the end of his Nicomachean Ethics. He says that people, he's got this giant book, the Nicomachean Ethics. It's actually the forerunner of another book called Politics. And so he says, in summation, then we can see that the development of friendships is key and that the art of legislation is crucial. Some states, like the Spartans, have a very thoroughgoing legislation. I could go into that. That's kind of a funny comment in itself. But he says, but most states leave all this to their families and to chance, like the Cyclops. And that's the whole reference. I saw that reading it one day and thought, of course I get what you're saying, Aristotle. That's hilarious, that one little sentence. And it leads to this whole poetry in time. You see what he's talking about. This is the folk knowledge of the people. They know what happens when that happens. It's kind of comical, but deadly serious. So, I was talking to you about my pleasure of being here in Wichita, making friends, and enjoying being in a town like this. New York's a special case. It's too big, and you really only know people in your immediate neighborhood or in your job. It can be very anonymous. And coming here, living where we do in College Hill, I like to sit on my porch and read, and I think that's a luxury. And I have sidewalks in my neighborhood. Now, I notice as we go farther out, the first thing that disappears is a sidewalk, right? You drive a little bit farther and the porches go away. They're like the appendix. Nobody knows what it's for. Let's just get it removed early. And then as you get way out there, you have neighborhoods that are arranged so no one ever has to actually look at each other. The houses are all kind of at oblique angles like this, and the thing they face to the street is a garage. That's what you see. You see that big cave. You see the stone door. What would happen if I walked into that place one day unannounced? I'd probably get shot, but hey, that makes sense. But people are losing the art of friendship, I think, and I may be wrong. This is where I say I may be wrong. My impression in the concrete world, coming from elsewhere and coming in here and finding a sort of a paradise of sorts, is moving around and seeing somehow this art has been lost. It has become impossible. And something to ponder as we think about this. Well, I'll just leave you with that and encourage you to think about the story of the Cyclops when you engage in politics. And remember, civilization is a great gift bequeathed to us. It collapses sort of in this style. The culture goes bad, which causes its machines, its artifacts, which include government, to go bad. And then once the government, which was built to be the servant of civilization itself, well, you can see what will happen next. Leisure will disappear, of course. You'll notice that. And then you will see that the possibility of civilization and choices are taken away from you. That's where freedom sits, actually. It sits at the apex of Western civilization. So thank you. Thank you for your kind attention. I think we have questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Back here.
Yes.
So, just to quibble a bit about Cyclops and libertarianism.
Yes.
Libertarianism is built upon the non-aggression axiom or principle, and eating someone without their consent, I think, qualifies as aggression. So, there's that. But my question was going to be, with regard to humanities, history, and so forth, I've always wondered and been unable to figure out, why do things happen when they do? For example, why was the programmable digital computer invented around 1950 and not 1550?
Well,
and an easy answer is, in 1550, we didn't know about electricity. But why didn't we know about electricity in 1550?
I've thought about this a lot too. So when we say that leisure is the basic principle of action, there's another one that's kind of rough. And that is that conflict is the basis of technology. So mechanical computers were in wide use to incorporate the von Schlieffen plan at the beginning of World War I. And so one of the things that happens, and in my title, it makes me kind of giggle because it works both ways. When we talk about the subversive pursuit of culture, we can be subversive in going after it, but also culture, or civilization rather. Civilization itself can subvert us. Because when life gets good, we don't make these kinds of inventions, or a lot of these kinds of innovations don't occur. And why do things happen when they do? Toynbee, the historian, would say it's because all of the struggles and the challenges that caused that culture in the first place have disappeared. And so a kind of general flabbiness sets in, and the whole business just gets to be about wine and cheese. So I've thought about this, and it is remarkable. It's usually that people can handle adversity to a certain degree better than they can handle prosperity.
You're a very interesting speaker.
Thank you.
For being here. My question is on the French Revolution, which I believe was the stupidest thing in world history.
I'd agree.
That it went to.
Well, maybe not the stupidest, but it's in the stupids. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly in the top 3 of the stupidest things in world history.
Yeah.
Do you see, as I see, some threads of the French Revolution happening in America, especially in terms of the way Christianity is being treated and not being credited for bringing civilization to the Western world?
Yeah, I didn't touch on Christianity and the Christianizing influence. I attempted to work my proof here today with one arm tied behind my back, you know. Being a Christian myself, I do think it's part of the redemptive motion of macro history that these things are happening. That civilization gets a little bit better, but I've also noticed that the fights in between get worse and worse. And so the French Revolution, are there similarities? Yes. Ideas of social justice are very much rights of man type, as opposed to Declaration of Independence. Rights of man being the French document. These concerns with égalité instead of freedom and liberty. We end up, this égalité, we're back to Edmund Burke. He says those things that seek to, what is it? Things that seek to level do not equalize. So you take you take things that are unvirtuous and you prop them up. Unvirtuous behavior. You say, oh, I'll subsidize that. Let me just give you some money. You're disadvantaged. And so you give people more stuff to do things that are not virtuous, and you're going to subvert the culture. You're going to, in the worst case, it ends at the guillotine. It ends at the Commission for Public Safety. Yes?
Yeah, I understand you correctly then. You see our civilization in decline because using the logic of being friends to create government, we have situations like Berkeley or the Florida students trying to tell the legislature how to run things.
Yeah.
And then the government, the tool we created to perpetuate society, is actually now not teaching history so that nobody knows what civilization was founded on.
Yes. They don't even know what civilization is.
Right. And so by that process, we now have an indeterminate future, and the logic just goes on down where there is no civilization.
It could happen. Usually it happens, it happens kind of slowly and imperceptibly, and then there's a big crash, right? It goes from terror to horror. But I think, well, I'm glad I'm in the business I am. That's why I'm so head up about it. I want to teach kids. I want them to recover these things. And I may be a little pessimistic, on the large scale when I see things. But what I would say is people need to, in their own communities, their real communities, need to pay attention to this amongst themselves. And stop thinking, you know, so American, broad, as if you could do anything about that anyway. It has to happen from the family actually up. The family is the smallest political unit. So all these signs look bad. And I'll admit to reading a lot of Oswald Spengler and things like that. He's a very pessimistic historian who talks about these things. I don't quite agree with him all the way, but I think we could do a good job. Rome lasted for, what, a long time. Yeah, the Romans had a long, I had a colleague of mine who said, well, the Gibbon's fall of the Roman Empire, it's kind of like watching somebody fall downstairs in slow motion. So if you can kind of slow it up a bit, that's good too. That gives people a chance to live and be free. And in my unguarded way, I would say, it allows the gospel to travel. I like that. Sir.
Thank you for bringing it to us. As you look back over history, I'm not asking you to be a sage necessarily, but as you look back over history, there seems to be periods of polarization when the culture falls apart because these people went this way and these people went this way and they got to fight and destroy the richest. Can you give us a little perspective about how you see that polarization over time and maybe equated to today?
Yeah. Recently, and among some other readings in Toynbee, I had it pointed out to me by another one of my dead friends that the rhythm seems to be a conflict between East and West ever since the Persian War with the Greeks, with an intermittent civil war like the Peloponnesian War, a renewed conflict between East and West, Alexander and the Persians, another civil war, the settling out of the Mediterranean, then the Carthaginian War in East and West between Rome, followed by a civil war, which is right, the Roman Empire growing. And this kind of rhythm seems to happen all the time. I used to be extremely puzzled why two Western nations would fight. World War I. I've always been incredibly fascinated with that conflict and the way it grew up. And it just defies sense. But I think it comes from being overly comfortable in the oikos, just the economy, the civilization, and then what was perceived as cultural gain was actually rot. Because a lot of things like Freudism and things like this came up in those days. And even in the classical music, there were some kind of sick ideas that were beautiful, like poison flowers that were growing. Richard Strauss, Wagner. I've sung a lot of Wagner roles myself, and I can tell you it's a lot like sniffing glue. It feels pretty good while you're doing it, but then when you stop and think about it, what is this guy saying? So there were some, and Nietzsche, a lot of these things crept in that we are suffering a little bit from a hangover from this Nietzschean existence, which it expresses it this way when we talk to our kids. You can be anything you dream to be. That's actually poisonous. That puts them at the center regardless of virtue or accomplishment. And that message needs to be moderated. You can be what your forefathers have made it possible for you to be. You have 24 hours in a day just like everyone else. You must have habits that are your servants rather than your masters. There are many things to be said to kids. And yeah, after World War II, the GIs coming back had sort of imbibed a lot of German romantic philosophy without actually knowing how it works. That's even more dangerous. We found these things, kind of like when the Romans sacked Corinth and brought back all the art, and the Catos always said, ever afterwards, this political family in Rome, they said, it looks like the Grecians conquered us after all, because the culture came in, everything just the civic reality started to fall apart. So these kinds of things, we have to be canny and cagey. That means we have to be kind of well-read and educated too, and talk to each other. Because these things creep in unawares. They creep in television commercials.
This will be our last question. I have a hard time focusing and formulating my question online, but in it, so we're teaching at classical school, classical liberal education. How do all the teachers are there, how do students develop their worldview in a but progressing toward logic and rational
yes.
thinking, without from the outside influence, when they go home and all the crap that they hear from the media and all that type of stuff. So how do you?
It's a bizarre world. But we have a plan, and we get a little better at it as time goes on. It's a relatively new movement, the classical school movement. Not all classical schools are religious. There are some in Chicago which are charter schools, which are public schools. Highly effective. So this will work in a lot of ways. So there's anthropology. You give the student what they need when they're ready for it. And we teach logic in 7th through 9th grade because that's when students are more concerned about being right than anything else, right? They're big about, That starts to happen about 7th grade. And then before that is the phase when kids always say, what's that, what's that, what's that, what's that? And that's when you're just shoveling, we call it grammar, just stuff into their heads, all of this stuff. Then you get to logic. We teach Aristotelian logic 7th through 9th. And while that's happening, we teach ancient, medieval, modern, 7th, 8th, 9th, and then ancient, medieval, modern, 10th, 11th, 12th. Consequently, I teach 7th and 10th grade at those levels. And then I do senior thesis. So our students have to actually say something, preferably something argumentative, to the entire student body and all the parents and the board before they graduate. So we prize things that people could disagree with because we feel like that's a profitable way to speak, exploring the question, moving forward. As to what I detect in the rest of your question, is sort of like, how does this school interact with the culture at large? When the parents come and they talk, do we actually understand each other? Not always. I had a new student come in and said, Mr. Snyder, I'm so excited to be at the classical school. I believe my earning potential will be unlimited. I just wanted to, get thee behind me. So, but that's why people are thinking. I've come to believe that we live in a fundamentally Epicurean age. The Epicurean versus the Stoic. The Stoic believes in the harmony of the universe. And doesn't necessarily believe in the gods or anything like that, but he'd make a better neighbor than an Epicurean. An Epicurean does anything he can to avoid pain. Why do you pay your taxes? Because they might hurt me if I didn't. That kind of stuff. And okay, you get some good results out of that, but you just don't get improvement, and you do get a dying, a withering of cultural engagement like that. So does that answer the question? A little?
All right, let's give him a big hand.
Thank you.